everybody, this is Naya from DoSpace, and today we will be talking about the history of BlackBerry. You can also find this presentation on DoSpace.org and YouTube, so let's get started. The BlackBerry is a line of smartphone devices made by a Canadian company, Research in Motion, since 1999. However, it wasn't until the early 2000s that the device began to resemble the smartphone that became so popular around the world. Although the company has used touchscreens in response to the phenomenal success of Apple's iPhone, which came years later in 2007, its device's responsive keyboard, physical keyboard, internet access, and solid security that cemented it as the most popular smartphone for business users. As with Apple's iPhone and Google's Android mobile systems, BlackBerry smartphones also support a range of apps and games. Making its debut in 1990, the BlackBerry 850 was its first handheld device with a two-way pager category, and it included a screen resolution of 132 to 65 pixels, a thumb keyboard, and a thumb wheel for scrolling. In 2002, the BlackBerry 5810 was launched, aimed at businesses rather than consumers, and was one of the early Java-based devices, offering a built-in mobile phone even if a headset was required at the time, running on a 2G network. Also in that same year, the 6710 was announced, and it was one of the first to offer an integrated phone and featured a large monochrome display with a 160 by 160 pixels. A year later, in 2003, the 6210 arrived along with other models. These two had an integrated phone, but they also offered medium monochrome display rather than large like the models the year prior. Their resolution stood at 160 to 100, and there was also a 6510 model that had an integrated phone and integrated two-way radio. In that same year, the BlackBerry 7290 was released, and it was the first color model, switching from the monochrome display over to a medium screen with 240 by 160 resolution, or a large one with 240 to 240 pixels. And it was the first device to offer Bluetooth in 2014, and also the first to offer Wi-Fi. The BlackBerry 7100 series consisted of several models which all offered what BlackBerry called a Shure type keyboard. Rather than the traditional physical keyboard, they had the same layout but used two letters per button, allowing the devices to become much slimmer, and had a 240 to 260 display. Between 2005 and 2006, the BlackBerry 8600 series was introduced and added more consumer features such as better displays, coming in with 320 by 240 pixel screens offering 65K color depth. And these models included the full physical keyboard format, making them wider than the previous series. The BlackBerry Pearl was the first BlackBerry to lose the track wheel for navigating around. Instead, it used a mini trackball at the center of its 5-button wide keyboard as a way to revolutionize the navigation device. And this was the first to arrive with a 1.3 megapixel camera, as well as a micro SD card support for up to 8 gigabytes. Arriving in 2007, the BlackBerry Curve came in a couple variations, which had a 2 megapixel camera, the trackball interface found on the Pearl, and a 320 by 240 resolution display. It also offered a wider format with a full physical keyboard an instantly found consumer favorite thanks to its low price and wide range of smartphone features. The BlackBerry 8220 Pearl Flip was introduced a year later with a clamshell form factor with an internal display of 240 by 320 and an external display of 128 by 160 pixels. It had the same trackball interface as the original Pearl, along with a 2 megapixel camera, 128 megabytes of internal memory, and micro SD support of 16 gigabytes. Also in 2008, the BlackBerry Bold first arrived with the 9000 model. It had a wider format like the Curve with the full physical keyboard, as well as a trackball interface. And this was the one that shook the world, making it a premium device that everyone wanted. It offered 480 by 220 megapixel display, along with a 2 megapixel camera, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and micro SD expansion for up to 16 gigabytes. The first BlackBerry Storm arrived at the end of 2008, featuring a clickable touchscreen but no physical keyboard, making it the first that BlackBerry tried to move to full touch, with the iPhone starting to make waves. However, this didn't go well. The model pictured had a 3.2 megapixel camera and a 360 by 480 resolution display with 1 gigabyte of internal memory. In 2009, the Storm 2 arrived with 2 gigabytes of memory, attempting to address the shortcomings of its original. In July of that year, the BlackBerry Tour had returned to its roots, offering a full keyboard, trackball, and a display of 480 to 360 pixels for a pixel density of 230 ppi with a 3.2 megapixel camera and micro SD expansion of 32 gigabytes. At the end of 2009 and at the beginning of 2010, the BlackBerry updated the Bold range with the 9700 model and the 9650 and the 9780. The trackball was replaced with a trackpad, and the resolution was jumped to 480 by 360 pixels, moving it to 250 ppi. The 9700 and 9650 models offered a 3.2 megapixel camera, while the 9780 offered a 5 megapixel autofocus camera. Also in that year, the BlackBerry Pearl was launched, bringing the optical trackpad found on the newer Bold models to a smaller format device. Like the original Pearl, it had the keyboard had 2 letters per button to allow for a slimmer build, a 3.2 megapixel camera, and micro SD expansion of the 2 gigabyte memory for up to 32 gigabytes. Also in that year was the BlackBerry Torch, featuring a 480 by 640 resolution, it could also slide up to reveal a full physical keyboard. Having on it as well is a 5 megapixel camera as well as an optical trackpad. The Torch was updated a few times in 2011, but not much had changed except for the increase in display and resolution. Just like the Pearl was updated, BlackBerry also updated the Curve model in 2010, introducing the optical trackpad as well as a 2 megapixel camera with video recording. The Curve was still popular because it was compact, compatible, and a great headset for messaging. With data still being expensive at the time, it was a great way to communicate. By the end of 2010, the BlackBerry Style was launched with an internal display of resolution of 360 by 400, while the external display had 240 by 320. And it also featured a full keyboard when open, along with an optical trackpad and a 5 megapixel camera. In the summer of 2011, the BlackBerry Bold was announced, offering a optical trackpad, a full physical keyboard and touchscreen interface, along with the NFC on board, as well as a 5 megapixel camera. And at the time, it was the thinnest BlackBerry available. The Z10 was first introduced in 2013 and also was the first to feature the new BB10 operating system. It had an 8 megapixel rear camera on board, as well as a 2 megapixel front camera, and offering 10 hours of talk time. Also in 2013, the Q10 was introduced and offering an 8 megapixel rear camera along with a 2 megapixel front camera, and featured a dual core 1.5 gigahertz processor with 2 gigabytes of RAM and 18 and 16 gigabytes of storage. In June of that year, the Q5 was announced with a full physical keyboard along with 5 megapixel rear camera and a 2 megapixel front camera. In October of that year, the Z30 was announced, having a 2880 battery, a 1.7 gigahertz dual core processor, and 2 gigabytes of RAM with 16 gigabytes of storage. It was touchscreen only, with no physical keyboard to offer. In September 2014, the Passport was introduced with mixed results. It was a maritime device featuring a 4.5-inch square display, a 13 megapixel rear camera along with a 2 megapixel front camera, and 3 gigabytes of RAM. And it also went back to offering a physical keyboard again. In December of that year, the BlackBerry Classic brought back the similar design to the Bold, which everybody knew and loved, having a 3.5-inch display, offering an 8 megapixel rear camera, a 2 megapixel front camera, and 2 gigabytes of RAM on board, as well as a 1.5 gigahertz processor. 4 months later, the Leap would move away from the physical keyboard, having a 5-inch display, a 8 megahertz rear camera, a 2 megapixel front camera, and a 1.5 processor with 2 gigabytes of RAM. Priv was the moment it changed everything for BlackBerry. It was the first Android device built by BlackBerry, marking the beginning of the end of its format. It featured a full physical keyboard hidden beneath a slide-up display, along with an 18 megapixel camera. The Key1 still ran Android, but featured a non-sliding keyboard directly beneath the display. It featured a 32 mAh battery and Snapdragon 625 processor, meaning it could go on for 2 days between charges. Following the Key1 is the latest flagship and the last from TCL. Now the keyboard is made noticeably bigger, ensuring that it's easier to type on, and it has a 3x2 display, but bumped up the processing power with the Snapdragon 660 chip with 6 gigabytes of RAM and a long-lasting 3500 mAh battery with its and also has a dual 12 megapixel camera system on the back. Even with the popular Android and iOS systems, the BlackBerry is still a useful tool, being the gateway to the ever-evolving smartphone market and will continue to be a blueprint for it even after it's long gone. And here are the resources that I used for the presentation. This has been Naya from DoSpace. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and have a nice day.